Well, fuck you too, buddy.
Who, what, where, why? Let's look at how you killed that guy. It's nice to meet you. Who, what, where, why? Let's look at how you did that crime. It's nice to meet you.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Knife to Meet You, the weekly serial killer podcast where we tell you about a killer you may not have heard of before. I am Brian, and with me as always is Zoe. Hi, Zoe.
Hi, Brian. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good today. I had a really good restful night's sleep, and I'm really excited to hear about this case that you've got for us today.
Yeah. Man, having a good night's sleep is so rare. I just love that feeling. I love the feeling when you wake up and you're like, oh my God, I'm rested.
Yeah.
You know? Because that never happens.
Right. You wake up and you say, wait a minute.
Yeah. Where is the endless fatigue of our entropied existence? All right. So, today, we're going to be talking about Arthur Shawcross, also known as the Genesee River Killer.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to start off by telling you, dear listener, that I done goofed. I made a mistake.
I like how she's telling this to you, listeners, and not to me.
Well, you already know because you were there when I made it.
Oh, fascinating.
We were hanging out while I was doing research, and normally, if we're hanging out while doing research, I say nothing to you. I don't comment on the research at all, other than to be like, oh my,
right.
On occasion, you know? But in this particular case, I started by reading Jack Olson's The Misbegotten Son. And at first, I really thought that I was reading the wrong book. I was like, this must be maybe Amazon made a mistake and they're giving me a sample from a different book or something. Because I was reading in her own words, a woman's life story. And I was like, the woman is from Rochester. And I thought it was weird because I know that Arthur Shawcross is from up there. And I was like, I don't know. But I kept reading it because this woman was just so endearing. I just loved her so much. And I was like, I don't know what it is I'm reading, but I'm going to keep reading it because I'm enjoying it.
Right.
And I just totally, completely fell in love with this woman, Mary Blake. And she was telling me all about, growing up and where she lived and, how they were poor and how her siblings, sometimes had to steal for them to eat and how they lived right next to different factories that, clogged up the air and eventually gave her mother cancer. And how, they lived by this black river that was just absolutely toxic from all the factory runoff. And she told us about all of her kids, and she told it in such a way that you really felt like you knew them.
Mm-hmm.
And my clear favorite of her children was Jack. And I'm going to read you a little excerpt about Jack. But it took me a while to realize that I was not, in fact, reading the wrong book. I was reading the right book.
Oh.
And I got emotionally invested with a character that I should not have gotten emotionally invested with.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. And so now I'm going to do that to you. I'm going to try as best I can to read this in Mary's voice because Jack Olson literally wrote this in her dialect. He replaces some letters with A and leaves off consonants where she would.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to try my very best to read this in her Rochester accent, but been a good decade since I've been up north, so.
I as someone with a lot of family from upstate New York, including Rochester, I've heard you doing it, and you're pretty on the money. It's not.
Thank you. Thank you. My sister has her husband's family is up in Rochester, so.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
As someone who's spent a lot of time in upstate New York, I can say that your voicing is very accurate to what I would assume this person sounded like.
Thank you. I do get a little Minnesotan in there sometimes, and I'll do my best to keep this, not Fargo.
It's so easy to go into because Minnesota accent is so fun to do.
Yeah.
That's the problem. It's so easy to revert to that.
So this is in the voice of Mary Blake, and she's talking about her son, Jack. Jack grew up fast. He was always moving, always into something. His asthma made him wheeze, but never slowed him down. One day, he was putting in a light bulb, bracing himself on the top of the door. My youngest child, Pam, was 5, and she runned up the stairs and slammed the door and took off the top of his finger. I wrapped a towel around his hand. We went and found Bob, and he drove us to the hospital. The doctor sent back to find the end of Jack's finger, and they sewed it on like new. Jack always took care of his younger brother. When little Pete fell in the river, Jack grabbed his arm and pulled him out just as he was going under for the 3rd time. I had a niece that drowned in that river near there. There's times when the black isn't much more than trickle, and times when it's so powerful that anyone who falls in drowns. If you try to jump in and save them, you're dead too. The black was never much use except for killing people. Runs north, too. Up the map. Who ever heard of a river flowing north? One winter, Jack shoved little Pete off a runaway toboggan just before it hit a tree. He was always doing things like that, cared more about the other people than he did himself. He wasn't the kind of kid to get in trouble. He took a loaf of day-old bread from the SPCA around the corner, but I forgave him because his father drank up his paycheck and we weren't eating at the time. I've taken a few things when I was hungry. Everybody has, right? If my kids were starving, I'd break a store window to feed them, but I raised them honest and they stayed out of trouble. Oh, Jack put his foot through the roof of a convertible, and the owner grabbed to the caps, but that was just being a boy, and sometimes he played hooky. He had blonde hair, freckles, big ears, and a pug nose like mine, and a turned-in foot that made him limp. My other kids called him Mama's boy, and I guess he was. When he was 7 years old, I was having a miscarriage in Mercy Hospital. I heard a yell outside my window, and it was Jack. "Mommy, are you coming home? I miss you." My own husband never came to visit me, too tired from lugging potatoes. Whenever Jack left the house, he hugged me and said he loved me. Never forget. He was different from my other children that way. Maybe it was because he had a different father, even though he didn't know the truth until he was 10. I had to tell him after he came to me in tears and wanted to know why his sisters didn't like him. I said, "They do like you." "No, they don't, Mommy. They call me jackass, donkey's ass. They're always picking on me." "Kids do that, Jack. It's not that they don't like you. They love you, son." He looked like he didn't believe me, so I said, "Jack, you're a special little boy. Everybody loves you." He asked what was special about him. I said, "Remember that man that took you to the hospital after you cut off your fingertip? That man that bought you cake and candy bars?" I took a deep breath and said, "Well, that's your real father. That's who I was with when I had you." He just stood there blinking his blue eyes. Maybe he had an inkling. Kids are smart that way, right? I said, "That doesn't mean you shouldn't respect Pete. He's treated you like his own flesh and blood for 10 years. Better than his own flesh and blood." It was true. Pete was mean, but never to Jack. I remember one day when Richie went out in the snow and changed a flat on our car, and Pete yelled, "I didn't tell you to do that, you son of a bitch. I would have did that myself." And the girls could never do nothing right. But he was good to Jack. Maybe it was Jack's bad foot, one cripple to another, or just the nice way Jack talked to him. Jack never said a word when I told him who his father was, just lowered his head and walked away. When he had something on his mind, he'd go up to his haven by the railroad tracks and work it out. I didn't tell him about the part about Big Pete threatening to kill Bob and how I'd started to stick our head in the oven. He didn't need stuff like that. I just said, "Well, I wanted you to know your bloodline. Always remember, you've got a father that's got some class." A couple minutes later, I seen him curled up with his white cat. I didn't know who was comforting who. I went out and brought him a new pair of sneakers. Are you already in love with this kid?
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
and
I know.
her, like, she,
right?
it's just, I want to buy her a slice of pie and a cup of coffee, like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
and like health insurance,
Well, it's so endearing, and she speaks about everything so honestly.
Oh, absolutely.
It's there's no like false pride,
No filter, yeah.
Yeah, it's just, this is what happened. Welcome to it, and it's not, nothing's unimaginable. It's just that's how things were.
That's life, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, very, very compelling the way that she tells these stories. And Jack's interesting, for sure. Obviously a little hesitant to like this kid because you told me that you made a mistake.
Oh, yeah, I did.
So, like,
I did. And now I'm doing it to you.
I'm waiting for the hammer to drop.
It was that same spring of 72 when Jack come home and told me that a stranger took him and little Pete fishing without my permission. I says, don't you never go near that man again. My God, he could have taken you somewhere and I'd never know what happened. A few days later, I opened the door and there was Jack with a dark-complected white man with close-set hazel eyes that slanted from the inside down. There wasn't much to his chin. He had long, heavy sideburns that were so dark it looked like he used mascara on them. He wore glasses with black frames and talked in a low, rumbly voice and wore a navy blue jacket. Jack was 4'7" then, and this guy looked about a foot and a half taller. He was wiry looking, 24, 25 years old. He had muscular arms and his shoulders sloped. Jack says, Ma, I just sold Art $1 worth of worms. Can I go fishing with him? I said, what'd I tell you the other day? Big Pete comes shuffling over to the door, and this guy Art said, I took your boys fishing the other day. I hope you don't mind. Pete said, yes, we do mind. It wasn't noon yet, and he was already half drunk. We never laid eyes on you before. Don't take my boys anywhere. Jack says, oh, Mommy, Art won't hurt me. He's my friend. I said, your father and I don't want you anywhere near this man. The guy took a step backwards, and I'll never forget what he told Jack. If your mother don't want you to go fishing with me, I'm not going to take you. Always abide by your mother's wishes. She don't want you with me. Then he smiled and left. I thought that's good advice, but I was surprised to hear it from a creepy-looking guy like him. The next Sunday, Pete promised to take the boys fishing as soon as he had his eye-opener. Jack liked to go with his dad, and he never got to do much fishing all day. He'd put worms on the hook for Pete, and then he'd have to go stand back and watch. Time was, Black River was full of trout, bass, walleye, but the pollution put an end to that. Now it was mostly catfish. Round noon, Pete was still pouring himself one last drink, and the boys was waiting in the yard. I said, why do you keep lying to these kids and telling them you're going to take them fishing? Heavens above, you're just going to get so drunk you can't get out of the house. I don't like you lying to the boys. He told me to shut up, so I went outside and said, you kids may as well go play because your father's too drunk to take you fishing. Lil Pete cried, and Jack just shrugged. He went through this before. I gave him $1 to buy food for his white cat at Ruthie's store up on Grant Street. He says, Mommy, can I go play at Maywood Terrace? I said, go wherever you want. Just be home for dinner. It's your turn for bingo. Knew he wouldn't miss that treat. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you guys had probably intimated by now, Jack didn't come home that night. 4 months after Jack had brought Arthur home, and, he was polite and agreed that she made the right decision not to let the kids play with him. 4 months later, on the morning of June 4th of 1972, Jack went out to play near the Cloverdale apartment block where Shawcross lived and never came home. Later that night, while out looking for her son, Mary Blake knocked on Arthur's door to ask where her son was. He told her that he hadn't seen him since that morning. The truth of the matter was that Shawcross had taken Jack into the woods, and after stripping him naked and forcing him to run through the woods, he caught him, raped him, and finally strangled him to death and battered him about the head. Later, Shawcross would admit to removing the boy's heart and genitals and eating them. Although Shawcross was a suspect in the boy's disappearance, no action was ever taken due to lack of evidence. 3 months later, while the police were still searching for Jack Blake, 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill was found dead under a bridge near Black River. She too had been raped, mutilated, and strangled. When a police investigation revealed that Hill and Shawcross had been seen together earlier the same day, Shawcross again became a suspect. 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill was visiting Watertown with her mother, Helene, and she disappeared. Her body was found under a bridge that crossed the Black River. She'd been raped and murdered. Oddly, mud, leaves, and other debris had been forced down her throat and inside of her clothing. Shawcross, who often fished under the bridge, was initially a suspect. After they received another report that Shawcross was seen eating an ice cream at the bridge near where the body was found, the police picked Arthur Shawcross up and took him in for questioning. He was interrogated at police headquarters for a full day before he surprised police by asking them in front of his defense attorney, "What's going to happen to me if I tell you something?" Can you imagine that you're like interrogating someone for child murder, and
Yeah.
this guy says, "What's going to happen to me if I tell you something?"
Right, you're gonna try and pull like the hypothetical, like so let's say hypothetically that maybe I were to admit to the potentiality of having ostensibly committed what may be referred to
Allegedly.
as murder. Like, what would happen?
By some
Like,
definitions.
it's like he passes the cop a note. Would you convict me? Check yes or no.
Right.
Like, come on, man.
Yeah, Arthur Shawcross is not smart enough to use like 50% of the words that you just said, but essentially, right? After several more hours of interviews and plea bargaining, Arthur Shawcross pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Karen Ann Hill. He was later convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. To this day, he has never been charged with the murder of Jack Blake, even though he later admitted to the rape and murder and showed police where he had dumped the body. He later told prison psychiatrists that he had returned to the gravesite on several occasions to have sex with the corpse. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But how is he not charged?
They didn't have enough evidence to charge him.
But he made an admission.
He was already in prison then.
Yeah, you can heap another charge onto him.
Oh, absolutely, but I don't know. Listen, I'm not here to defend the Rochester Police Department.
No, I know you're not. It is just patently.
I'm just telling you what happened. It is patently absurd.
Like, for all of the people that get convicted for making false admissions, when a guy says, yes, I did this, and he's correct, and they don't do a damn thing about it, oh, man. Oh, that DA, whoever that was.
Right?
Not making great decisions.
So, this was actually Arthur's second stint in prison. His first one was after April 1969, when he set fire to a local paper mill, and later in the year, the cheese factory where he was employed at the time. He was arrested and convicted on 2 counts of arson and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served the first 6 months of his sentence at Attica, where 3 black inmates allegedly raped him. I don't know. He's the absolute definition of pathological liar. He says a lot of stuff. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's according to his allegations or according to prison records or what, but Shawcross claims he later exacted revenge by beating and raping each of his attackers in separate incidents, and then was transferred to Auburn Prison to serve out his sentence. And then in 1971, he was given an early release when he saved the life of a prison guard who had been clubbed during a prison riot sparked by racial tension. So he returned to Watertown to start a new life. And then in 1972, obviously was arrested for he was taken in for questioning and then pled guilty to the murder or manslaughter of Karen Ann Hill. So, sentenced to 25 years in prison, right? So, Arthur Shawcross began his second jail term in the New York Penitentiary in Greenhaven. I don't know why I said it like that. For the first 8 years, he spent much of his time protecting himself from the other inmates who considered child killers to be the lowest form of life. His record shows numerous reports of fighting, minor stealing offenses, lighting fires, and refusing to leave his cell. Eventually, he began to settle into prison life and behave himself until finally he was considered to be a model prisoner.
Oh.
Yes. There's some information here about psychological examinations done by psychiatrists in the prison. We're going to save that for part 2 of the episode. But eventually, he was ruled to be a normal individual who knows what he has done wrong and would like to help himself get back on the right track for his eventual return to society. Basically, what most of the doctors were trying to say was that under normal circumstances, Arthur Shawcross was a passive individual, but when subjected to stress, he became a slave to his inner sexual drives and was unable to prevent himself from giving them full rein. Regardless of these and other unfavorable psychological reports, Arthur continued to quote-unquote improve himself in prison, and by 1985 had completed his high school education and enrolled in college courses at Penn State University. A parole report during the same period further stated that Shawcross, quote, exhibited a belligerent reaction representing a foreboding potential for a possible reenactment of his tragic behavior, unquote. The report went on to further criticize the prisoner for his disdain for the prison's sex offender program and displaying his, quote-unquote, fury during the parole review. Incredibly, despite the numerous psychological reports to the contrary, and the parole board's own misgivings, Arthur Shawcross qualified for early release in March of 1987 and was deemed to be, quote, fit to re-enter society, unquote.
Well, of course, it's 1987. Reagan's got all of these drug criminals to arrest.
Mm-hmm.
Like they've got to throw people who have a quarter ounce of weed on them into prison for 20 years so we can let all these murderers loose.
Precisely.
God.
You get it.
Oh my God.
Uh-huh.
It's fucking awful. Holy shit.
After his release, Robert T. Kent, his parole officer in Binghamton County, wrote to his superiors, quote, at the risk of being melodramatic, the writer considers this man to be possibly the most dangerous individual to be released in this community for many years, unquote. No one did anything. This next part of the story is my absolute...
Is he like the son of a senator or something?
No.
Is there like
Nope.
no like nepistic connections?
Nope, not rich. Nothing like that.
Just slipped through the cracks.
Mm-hmm. Yes. This next part of the story is my absolute favorite. So when Shawcross was released, he was placed in the Binghamton areas as the officials and residents of Watertown had made it plain they didn't want him there. He had also been maintaining a pen pal relationship with a woman named Rose Wally, and indicated he would go and live with her and probably marry her. But his parole conditions, among other things, required him to restrict his movements to Broome County. Learning that he would be placed in their area, the Binghamton parole officers asked the question that the parole board should have considered before his release. If he had to have such strict parole conditions, why release him in the first place? His stay in Binghamton only proved to be a short one when the residents objected to his presence and he was given approval to move to Delhi, New York, where he moved into Rose Wally's apartment. Shortly after he moved in there, however, residents of the new community got wind of his presence and he was asked to leave. He appealed to the parole board and was sent to live in the basement of the Baptist Church in Delhi until suitable accommodations could be found. He and Rose later moved to Fleischmann's, New York, and moved into a large house, and Arthur obtained work with a local building contractor. Within a matter of days, he was recognized in the local post office, and later that night, an angry mob led by the town's mayor assembled outside his house and demanded that he leave the area. In the following weeks, Shawcross and Wally were bounced around from one area to the other until finally they were given an apartment in Rochester. Eventually, according to Shawcross, he tired of the parole board's interference, and he and Rose got their own apartment and new jobs and settled into their new surroundings. The job that Arthur got was at a company called Bonya's, where he was employed to pack salads in boxes.
That mayor's fucking awesome.
Right?
Like, you said he's there, the people want him out. Angry mob. Oh, cool. I love it. Led by the mayor. Like, fuck yeah, you are. Get out there, Mayor of Binghamton. Get the...
So, like, even the people of
shit.
New York were like, why the fuck did you release this guy? Like,
yeah, like
they were all very perplexed.
The entirety of upstate New York, the entire Finger Lakes region, just said "not in my backyard" to this guy, and got him like, wow, like excommunicated from every town they tried to place him in.
Yep. Yeah.
These people rock. Like,
they really do.
Oh my god.
And it turns out, which I'm sure will come to you as a huge surprise, that these people were right to do so. So, I was reading from one Crime Library article. That one was by Patrick Bellamy. And now I'm going to switch to another crime lab by Catherine Ramsland, which sounds familiar to me. I think she wrote the one that I read when I did Dennis Nilsson, actually.
I was going to say, the name sounds familiar.
Yeah. The Genesee River Gorge outside of Rochester, New York, is a scenic vacation and recreation spot that features 3 picturesque waterfalls alongside the Genesee River. The area offers activities for hikers and picnickers, as well as people out fishing and hunting. 22 miles long and fairly deep, the gorge is touted as the Grand Canyon of the East. No one ever thought about murder there, at least not until 1988. It was a hunter and his companions at Salmon Creek along Route 31 who came across a sight that they would never forget. It was nearing the end of winter on March 24th, and the ice had broken over the water. Rising to the surface and covered in silt was the body of a dead woman, clad in jeans and a sweatshirt. At first they thought she was a discarded mannequin, but one look at her frozen face told them otherwise. The men called the authorities and they brought the corpse out of the water. It was clear right away from the bruises that this woman had been beaten, but they allowed the medical examiner Nick Forbes to complete a full examination and autopsy before making a final judgment. He noted that she had been strangled. Vaginal trauma surrounded by teeth marks was clear as well, although this might as easily have occurred after death as before. She appeared to have been viciously kicked in the groin. Though she'd been in water, she had not drowned. There was no water in her lungs, and so her killer had dumped her there after she had died. It wasn't long before she was identified as Dorothy Dotsy Blackburn, 27 years old, a regular sex worker on what they called Prostitute Row along Rochester's seedy... Well, fuck you too, buddy.
That's staying in. That's the intro.
A regular on what was known as Prostitute Row along Rochester's seedy Lyell Avenue, and the mother of 3 children. Her sister had filed a missing persons report on March 18th, and it was she who identified the body. Dr. Forbes determined that Blackburn's wounds had been made by a blunt object, but could not identify just what had made the patterned indentation about 2 inches wide across her chest. It had left a mark, but had not broken the skin. He took photographs and made a note of what he saw, but did not otherwise comment. Sex worker murders were not unusual, and this woman had unfortunately been a cocaine addict with a debt. A disgruntled customer, a cheated drug pusher, an angry pimp. Almost anyone could have done this, and without physical evidence, it would be difficult to link this killer, let alone prosecute that person. At the time, sex work was considered a high-risk occupation with a low risk of discovery for whoever decided to target such women for murder. So the Rochester police examined the shooting and knifing murders of 2 other sex workers in the area, but spotted nothing to link them. They made a file for Dotsy. Away. A year passed, the case faded, and then they started finding other dead women. Yeah.
Obviously, the acts that Shawcross committed were heinous. Yet the people who had the ability to stop him from doing it again consistently chose not to.
Yes, that is correct.
And it's so frustrating.
Yes.
Because
none of this had to happen.
Well,
none of it.
Absolutely. Like Shawcross didn't need to murder the first people he murdered, but the people that he was allowed to murder after his parole is just, I can't understand how.
Especially when you consider that he he admitted to murdering a second child. And this was not even his first strike. He was already in for arson.
Double arson. He burned
correct.
down a cheese factory. It is. Mm-hmm. It's just
a gross miscarriage of justice. Yes.
Well, I didn't want to say we said the line, everyone. Yep. But yeah, it's
everyone take a shot.
Right, exactly. To take a shot for every gross miscarriage of justice observed on Knife to Justice.
Yeah. No,
well, no, shots of justice can only come from Dr. Justice, and he's on sabbatical right now.
Oh, that's right. I forgot we had that as a gag.
Uh-huh.
All right. Many people were involved in this case and have written about it or produced it in various forms. Not all of the accounts agree on the details, so those who had first-hand involvement are accorded more credibility than those who received documents secondhand. Greg McCrary was called into it from the FBI as a behavioral profiler, while former FBI Special Agent Robert Ressler evaluated certain aspects of it. Dorothy Lewis and Joel Norris were both invited into the case and both addressed their participation in separate books, while Mark Olshaker made an award-winning film production for Nova. Jack Olson, a true crime writer, added his own rendition with The Misbegotten Son, which I read from earlier. Mm-hmm. The longest account of the case ever produced, including detailed comments from many participants, including Mary Blake.
I'm sorry, many what? You cut out just on that word.
Many participants, including Mary Blake.
Okay, good Mary Blake.
We love Mary Blake.
We stan Mary Blake.
Right?
Nice to meet you, listeners.
She had such a hard life. And she tried so hard, and she did her absolute best, and she's such a good woman. Just my heart.
And so humble, and so just a very kind woman. I love the way that she talks about, like, the way that it weaves together everything. You understand what's important to her.
And her son is so sweet, and I just really I try not to get too attached to the victims because it makes it impossible to do this, but the second he came home with a guy named Art, I went, oh no.
Yeah.
And you and I were on the phone at the time, and I was like, oh, Brian, oh, this is bad.
Yeah.
This is so bad.
Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah.
Holy moly.
Yeah. Nothing much happened during successive months after the discovery of Dorothy Blackburn, and her murder remained, as I said, unsolved. Several more sex workers were killed during the summer of 1989, although none of the cases seemed clearly linked to one another, and none seemed unusual. Which is like, I'm sorry.
Right.
The murders didn't seem unusual? Why is murder usual for you people? Maybe get up off your asses and do your fucking jobs. Just a suggestion.
I don't know what to tell you, Pally. It's just another moiter.
One woman had been dumped along the roadway on an exit ramp, another had been shot, and a third one had been killed by a car in a way that looked suspicious. No one seems to have elaborated on what made it look suspicious. They just said, killed by a car in a way that looked suspicious. And I want to know more about that. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, the phrasing also kind of makes it seem like it was the car who did it, we're dealing with a Christine situation.
Right?
Killed by a car, not with a car.
The car is the murderer.
Yeah.
The police had reason to sit up and take notice on September 9th when a man looking for empty bottles to sell came across another set of remains. He spotted a bone sticking up and believed it was from a dead deer. But upon closer inspection, he saw a pile of clothing, so he knew what he'd found and reported it. The woman had apparently floated upriver, as Joel Norris describes it, until construction debris had snagged her in place. No one had quite seen her there, and she had decomposed quite a bit, making it difficult for Dr. Forbes to offer a cause of death, although he listed it as probable asphyxia. There were no knife or gunshot wounds evident in the bones, but who was she? So, according to Jack Olson in The Misbegotten Son, the police found 138 reports of missing women that could potentially be matched to this body that they had found. 138 missing women.
Just in the city of Rochester.
Well, I mean, or the surrounding area, I assume.
Maybe. Yeah, that's still a lot. That's a lot of missing women.
That's way too many. Way too many. 138? What the fuck are the police doing? Christ. Okay. All right.
Not solving murders.
I have to, like, really keep my unmitigated rage in check here because it gets worse, you know? So all 138 reports of missing women were eventually eliminated. So it wasn't any of those 138 women, which is like, okay, all right, cool. Eventually, after, they've been unable to identify her or find someone like her as being reported missing from the area, the police hired William Rodriguez III, a forensic anthropologist, to use the victim's skull to reconstruct what her face had looked like. This is fucking awesome. I love forensic anthropology. I actually minored in anthropology, and I'm obsessed with Kathy Reichs and the TV show Bones, which is based on her work as a forensic anthropologist. The process that they use is long and involved, but it's super fucking cool. So they take the skull and they use markers to identify the thickness or the depth of the muscle tissue on various parts of the face, which we know because they're standard in human creation. And then using the musculature on top of the existing bone structure of the skull, they are able to use clay and create a distinct face, adding a wig, fake eyeballs, and some, artistic license. They can produce a photograph of the final product, which looks like a bust of a real person. And then they publish that photograph in local papers. The victim's distraught father was able to identify her as Anna Steffen, and dental records confirmed it.
Wow.
The man believed that a drug dealer or a pimp had killed her. So her body had been discovered pretty far away from where Blackburn's body had been found. And while their manner of death and disposal may have been similar, no one was talking at that point about a multiple killer, so they were not linked.
Right.
On Saturday, October 21st, 6 weeks later, 3 sportsmen from Pennsylvania went into the gorge and came across the remains of a decomposing headless corpse that was mostly bones, hidden in tall grass along the riverbank. Her neck was broken, and the cause of death was difficult to determine, but it seemed to have been done by blunt impact with something. As her remains were collected, Norris writes that nobody realized that the killer was standing nearby watching them.
No.
Yes, he appeared to be just an ordinary fisherman, someone who frequented the area, and so no one gave him a thought. Olson says that an employee of the county jail read about the discovery and reported that a homeless woman named Dorothy Keeler, age 60, had not been seen in some time. Again, the remains were given to the anthropologist, and the identity was made. 6 days after that, nearing Halloween, a boy retrieving a ball saw a foot sticking out from beneath a pile of debris and cardboard near a YMCA that was not far from the gorge. He summoned the police, who uncovered a decomposing corpse dressed in black pants and a sweater. The dead woman turned out to be Patty Ives, a Lyell Avenue sex worker whose loss apparently made her pimp cry. He was not a viable suspect.
Huh.
Yeah, I do want to point out that in this Crime Library article, they call her Once Pretty. Like, why do these people feel the need to, like, kick them while they're down? Like, she's already been serial killed. You're going to call her a fading beauty too? Like, fuck you.
Or are they attempting to imply that her corpse is ugly? Like,
all
either
corpses
way,
are ugly. Like, that's...
Well, I mean, yeah, true. But I mean, like, or is it because of the way she was killed? Was she, like, was she cut up and mutilated like the others? Maybe that's the implication, or...
No, I think they were... the sentence was pretty clear.
They're just being sex ageist?
Yeah, they said, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The equivalent of, ew, old.
I think it was a combination of that and prejudice against sex workers and just generally being a dick. So that made 4 apparently dead by asphyxia, with 3 in quick succession, and the press began to write about the Rochester Strangler and the Genesee River Killer. So some of these women had been concealed beneath something, and cops suspected that the killer might be afraid of air patrols, which indicated either criminal or military experience. And now the pressure was on to stop this person. It was suggested from lack of struggle on the part of the victims that this killer, the strangler, killed quickly and was probably quite strong, and appeared to be able to strangle the women without much effort. Since he was targeting mainly sex workers, the vice cops went around and started talking to some of the women who they knew were in the same trade. Lieutenant James Bonnell is quoted as saying in The Misbegotten Son, "When these killings started, we figure we're going to need the cooperation of every prostitute." On average, around 35 women worked the area at any given time, but a lot of them came and went. So the fact that they're transient makes it really difficult to keep track of them.
Right.
The police sat in unmarked cars watching them and allowing them to actually do their job, which is fucking amazing. The first time the police have actually done something right here.
The first police sex worker sting out, where they sting out. Oh my gosh, the first police sex. This is such a hard thing to say.
You can words good.
I can do it. I promise I can do it. The first police sex worker sting operation where they didn't stop sex workers from doing sex work.
Right.
First and last, let's be honest, probably.
They did, however, suspect a transvestite, a man dressed as a woman who the author describes as rather striking. I love how this person has to comment their personal opinion on everyone's appearance.
Right. And the chief investigator, who had a coffee stain on his shirt,
The reason they suspected him was because he seemed to get the most action, but there was nothing overtly suspicious about him. The women were tentative about this unusual arrangement. They were not altogether trustful that the police watching them wouldn't just bust them, and neither side was used to working with the other, but they did feel safer. So the cops knew that several of these women were streetwise and tough, and if the strangler got near one of them, he'd be worse for it. They were certain they'd spot the guy. June Cicero had her own moves, for example, and she'd be likely to maim anyone she suspected of even the slightest bad intent. In fact, she would not even walk up to a car she did not know. She had a good instinct. Another sex worker, described as a hefty older female who went by the name Joanne von Nostrand. Joanne von Nostrand told them about a John named Mitch that she'd been with one night that had seemed potentially violent. He was strange too, she added. He had mentioned the strangler had taken her pretty far afield and had wanted her to pretend she was dead. He was real nervous, she said later on The Mind of a Killer, and that made me nervous. Little things kept clicking and the hairs on the back of my neck started standing up. She'd brought out her knife and told him she'd use it. He did not seem upset about that and even admired her for it, though she was sure that he'd try reaching for her throat several times. He wanted to see her again, but she avoided him. So word spread among the women to be on the lookout for suspicious behavior in men who approached them. They were nervous, but not so much that they didn't still get in cars with their customers. They told the cops repeatedly about a suspicious gray van that roved the area, but the driver of one that they stopped turned out to be just an ordinary guy. Leads came in every day, but none proved to be constructive. Other sex workers were soon missing, like Maria Welch, who actually resembled Patty Ives in build. I think they were both blonde as well. Another petite blonde was discovered dumped in the gorge down a steep slope wearing only a pair of boots. Her cause of death was asphyxia, and bruises on the body indicated she had been beaten. Everyone assumed this victim was Maria, but they were wrong. Her name was Frances Brown, and she had been out with a customer named Mike. A few Johns were questioned. Actually, you know what? It doesn't say that it was a customer. It just says she'd been out with someone named Mike. Could be a boyfriend, friend, anyone. But my initial gut reaction was that it was a customer. A few customers were questioned, but none panned out. Some of the early victims were traced to their killers, but most of the cases remained unsolved. The police thought that they had a series of 6 to 8 women who had been killed by the same man. Checking files of sexual predators who'd been paroled from upper New York prisons, they found nothing to indicate that they had one in the area. Then, an older man whose 26-year-old girlfriend had been missing for 18 days decided to report her. She had mental problems and sometimes just stayed away, but he hadn't heard from her in far too long, much longer than any previous times that she had gone missing. He had taught her to stay out of strangers' cars, so he didn't believe that she'd fallen victim to anyone, but he was worried. Since she wasn't a sex worker, the police didn't believe that she was vulnerable to the serial killer that they had, so they just took down the information about missing June Stott and spread it around to the patrol officers, but their primary concern was the next potential victim of the strangler. What I really hate when, in the early days of hunting serial killers, is how much they exclude information based on the very limited understanding that they have of serial killers. And that's why it's so important to study serial killers. It really is, because that's how you fucking catch them. That's how you stay safe from them. On November 15th, Kimberly Logan, a black sex worker from the Lyell Avenue area, was discovered dead beneath a pile of leaves in someone's yard. She'd been battered and kicked in the abdomen, and oddly, the medical examiner found leaves stuffed down her throat.
What?
Yeah. So much outlying, information here. She was not found near the gorge or its general locales. The leaf thing is weird. She's found in someone's yard, and she did not fit the ethnic profile of the previous victims. So that's like a huge outlier there.
Yeah.
Her file was added to the growing pile of other unsolved murders in the area's women of the night. I didn't think people use that expression anymore, but apparently this person does.
Ladies of the evening, as it were.
Right. 8 days later on Thanksgiving, a man named Mark Stetzel was out walking his dog to burn off, the heavy meal he'd had. He went into a marshy area near the industrial piers, and his dog ran off down a trail, so he followed and came to a clearing where he spotted a piece of stiff carpeting, which was iced over. When he walked closer, he saw a bare foot beneath it, so he called the police. It was a raw day, hinting at snow, with most of the evidence technicians and investigation team members home with their families having their Thanksgiving dinner, but they all responded and went out to see the discovery. So they, including First Assistant District Attorney Chuck Saragusa. If they had a genuine serial killer in the area, he wanted to stay on top of these cases. And as Captain Lynd Johnston commented, they were falling like hail. That's a super, sensitive way to describe the situation, although he's not wrong. As you can see, we were going from weeks in between the bodies to now days in between the bodies.
Yeah.
It is really ramping up. The woman had luckily been preserved somewhat by the cold weather and the covering. She lay face down, and spots on her skin suggested decomposition, so she had been killed earlier by as much as 2 or 3 weeks. But that would be for Nick Forbes to tell them. A considerable amount of blood had settled into her back, which meant that she had been lying on her back after death for at least 12 to 24 hours in order for her to have back lividity. And now here was on her face. So obviously she had been somewhere else, and then her body was moved.
Just really quickly, can you define back lividity? I haven't heard that term, or it's not familiar to me.
So when someone dies, their blood begins to settle, and there are several different stages of death, rigor mortis when your muscles all tense up, but also lividity, which is the quality or state of being livid, specifically referring to the reddish or bluish purple discoloration of the skin due to the settling and pooling of blood from gravity. So,
if I can I see if I understand? Knowledge check.
well, hold on.
Okay.
Livor mortis is characterized by basically the areas in which they can see the discoloration, which tells them where the blood pooled. Since it occurs directly after it's fixed in 4 to 6 hours. So that is
So,
yes.
But not 4 to 6 after, but after death.
4 to 6 hours after death, the red color no longer disappears on pressure because of the cooling of the body. Mm-hmm. And then the fat surrounding the capillaries solidifies, which constricts the capillaries and prevents the return of blood into them. So it takes 4 to 6 hours for lividity to appear. And then you have to be in a given position for a certain amount of time for the blood to settle.
Right.
In a way that causes the lividity discoloration.
The one that persists.
Yes.
So because she had it on one spot, but not on the spot where they found her body, they were able to determine that it was moved because of that.
I mean, there are probably other indications that her body had been moved anyways, but the fact that her lividity markings were on her back shows that she had been lying on her back 4 to 6 hours after her death.
Right.
And when she was found face down, yes. So it was a clear indication that her body had been someplace else for a long period of time and then moved.
Right.
So some postmortem changes are observable from 2 to 4 hours. Livor mortis is also referred to as lividity or hypostasis. Is the gravitational pooling of blood to lower dependent areas, resulting in it kind of looks like bruising, to be honest with you. They call it like a red-purple discoloration, but it's commonly seen between 2 and 4 hours post-mortem. Its onset may begin in the early period as little as 30 minutes, but the coloration is not fixed, and the pressure of the skin can cause blanching. So during this period, changing the position of the body can result in resettling of the blood in newly dependent areas. Right. After a period of time, the blood coagulates and livor mortis becomes fixed, right? So they know that the timing of the onset of it is variable, but normally begins, 2 to 6 hours, and then has extended over the body by 12 hours post-mortem, right? Kind of like rigor mortis. So if they had moved her within 12 hours of this lividity setting in, it wouldn't have settled all in one place. So you can have multiple lividity markings. All right?
Yeah.
But after a certain period of time, it is fixed. And since it was fixed on this body, they know not only that she was in a different position, but that she was there for somewhere between 4 and 12 hours, basically.
Yeah.
So they know that she was there for a lengthy period of time, is basically what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I had never heard lividity. I've heard of livor mortis because it was pallor, algo, rigor, liver, and then putrefaction.
Right.
But like lividity was a new term to me, but I appreciate the explanation. That's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's technically part of decomposition, but it's not really the body decomposing. It's just the blood settling,
right?
Because it's no longer being moved around.
Right. Like there is. I mean, post death, the body is actively decomposing all the time, but not in the way that we would consider
right
post putrefaction decomposition.
Yes. And it's usually most evident after about 2 hours, but it can start as soon as 15 minutes after death. Initially, the color is red, but it later becomes purple because the oxygen dissociates from the hemoglobin.
Right.
And this color can be variable, actually, depending on the circumstances of death and the environment. So cold temperatures will delay the dissociation of oxygen from the hemoglobin, which delays the color change. Carbon monoxide poisoning will produce a really bright, vibrant cherry red color.
Huh.
And so will cyanide poisoning. And it may not appear in bodies that are very anemic to death. So, the more you know.
Well, no, that actually makes a lot of sense, because with an iron deficiency, you're not going to have enough hemoglobin for the
settling to occur. That's correct.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Neat.
Yes. A considerable amount of blood had settled in this woman's back, which meant that she had been lying on her back after death for a lengthy period of time, and now here she was on her face. Someone had come and turned her over or moved her. Her position suggested that she'd been sodomized after death. She'd also been strangled, but when they turned her over, they saw that sometime after she had died, she'd been cut from the top of her chest between her breasts all the way down into her vaginal area, which is very reminiscent of a gutted deer. Upon close inspection, it looked as if the vaginal lips had been removed, and the killer had returned at different times to do these things. So it was post-mortem.
Post-mortem mutilation.
Yes, that is correct. This killer had returned to sexually assault the body, but in the morgue they found no semen in or on the body in their analysis. In the weeds surrounding the body, the techs found a knife and a bloody towel, but there were no fingerprints, and as usual, there was very little physical evidence. The victim was soon identified as the missing June Stott. As far as anyone knew, she was not a sex worker, had never taken drugs, and investigators wondered whether this homicide was part of the series of homicides or something new. She'd also been found 7 miles downriver from the other dump sites. So now they are wondering, did they have several killers on their hands, or was one killer just dumping bodies all over the place? Mm-hmm. They did note that the victim had been covered and asphyxiated like many of the other victims. So at this point, Captain Johnston is super frustrated and he calls in the FBI. He now had 11 unsolved cases of sex worker murders in and around Rochester in a year's time. Since the average per year was 3 or 4, he knew they had a real problem and no good leads. So that's when they called in Special Agent Greg McCrary of the Behavioral Science Unit, who listened to his descriptions of the rash of murders since the spring of the previous year and agreed that they might have a serial killer operating in the area. McCrary, who documents the investigation from a behavioral perspective in the book The Unknown Darkness, Profiling the Predators Among Us, invited New York State Trooper Lieutenant Ed Grant, a graduate of the FBI's training program in criminal investigative analysis, to join him in Rochester. Before McCrary and Grant even arrive in Rochester, a hunter found the body of a sex worker named Elizabeth Gibson on November 27th in a swamp in a neighboring county. She had also been strangled, but what linked her to the others was a witness. So I don't know if you remember when I was talking about Joanne von Nostrand, who, the sex worker who had thought that, this guy named Mitch was a real creepy dude. She had happened to see that client, Mitch, the day before with Elizabeth Gibson. So the news flash that day on television told her that Elizabeth had been found and murdered, and she went directly to the police to tell them about Mitch. They took her to the station, but Joanne did not know Mitch's real name or where he worked. Officer Leonard Borriello believed that she had given them a solid lead. At the very least, they knew how the guy operated and what kind of car he drove. What they did not know is that he would change cars and remain in the shadows. McCrary and Grant arrived on December 13th, a couple of weeks after the discovery of June Stott, and asked to see the various crime scenes. Starting with Lyell Avenue, the presumed pickup point for most of the victims, and then going out to the YMCA area and the canyon, they observed anything that might provide a means for better analysis. Then they went to the quote-unquote war room, where the files of every murder of women in the area were piled onto a conference table. To establish a series of linked crimes, they would go through the autopsy reports, crime scene photos, witness statements, and anything else the police had gathered on each and every case. The goal of the first day, McCrary writes, was to get a preliminary determination of a pattern we didn't know yet. For any case like this, it's a filtering process. We look at it in phases of refinement. We'd read a case and then keep going back to cases we'd already been through to compare details and do more analysis based on what we were learning. They placed the files in the order in which the women had been killed, so chronologically, and established 3 rings based on their manner of death and their lifestyle when alive. So one ring was for those cases clearly in the series, asphyxiated sex workers dumped in or around the gorge. Then there was a ring for those that appeared to have some similarities, and finally, those cases that seemed unrelated, which were put aside. They saw a definite pattern emerging for 7 of the cases, with a few remaining unclear. The victim who bothered them the most was June Stott. She'd been asphyxiated, but she had also suffered from postmortem mutilation in a way that none of the other women had. It could mean that she did not belong to the series and had not been killed by the same man as the others, McCrary explains, or it could mean a change in the killer's behavior. Perhaps he was getting used to bodies and coming back to abuse them. It was clear to the profilers that the killers had not taken the victims far, only a few miles from Lyell Avenue. They saw that as a clue from the areas with which he was most familiar and most comfortable. It also meant he had a vehicle of some kind to transport them because the dump sites had all been too far to walk to. And if he was familiar with the place, he either jogged there or he fished or hunted. So all really relevant to his profile. It was also clear that he was someone with whom the women were comfortable because they appeared to have gotten in the car with him without being afraid, despite the fact that a killer was in the area picking up sex workers. It was likely that he was a known customer, and since most of the victims had been white, perhaps all of them, he was probably white as well. They were looking right through him, says McCrary, because they believed the killer had to be somebody else. The fact that no overt sexual assault had occurred with any of the women indicated that this man might have trouble completing the sexual act. It could also be that these women who had ended up brutalized and killed had ridiculed his impotence. When they decided to include June Stott in the series, they took a closer look. The fact that she had been cut open indicated to them that the killer was experienced, probably with killing and cutting up game. He was comfortable with bodies. They believed that he would continue to visit his victims as long as he was sure he could do so without getting caught, and that he would continue to mutilate them. Grant and McCrary then presented the results of their analysis to the task force. From the behavioral evidence available from the crime scene, they told the task force that the killer was most likely a white male in his late 20s or early 30s. They cautioned everyone not to eliminate a suspect from any detail in a profile, since this was an art and they could easily be wrong. The task force should use this merely as a guide. They did believe that the guy had criminal experience, especially sexual offenses, and would have a record somewhere, even though every effort had been made to find one. In addition, he worked alone, he was probably a sportsman, and he was likely personable. There was nothing noticeable about him, and he probably worked right under everyone's nose. He'd look normal, drive a basic car, and dress in functional clothing. The killer was extraordinarily ordinary, probably someone they knew, McCrary writes. It was likely that he worked but at a menial job, and he was probably married or had a girlfriend. His economic level was similar to that of the victims. He lived and worked in the city, and he was streetwise, which again indicated experience. They thought he worked or lived near the Lyell Avenue area, and concealing the victims from helicopter searches overhead showed a certain degree of cunning. Based on this set of details, they offered some strategies. They believed that the cops knew him in some capacity and that he might be hanging out in coffee shops or bars. They thought they could look around and get some names. They might also put surveillance on the body found in the future, since the killer had started to return to his kills. McCrary said that the cops persuaded the owners of Mark's Texas Red Hot, an all-night bar, to raffle off a television set. From that contest, they were able to collect a good list of names of people who frequented the place. At the same time, from a computer search with the criteria, a suspect was developed. According to Olson, a 38-year-old sex offender who drove a gray van, was known for kinky practices, and was seen on Lyell Avenue several times. Everyone on the task force believed they had their man, but a check with his employer turned up alibis for the times of most of the murders, so they were back to square one. Then, in the weeks before New Year's, several more women turned up missing, and one of them was someone everyone had felt certain would never fall victim to a killer. So you remember when we were talking about the sex workers earlier that the cops were really confident would never be victimized because
Right.
they were so street smart and they street smarts and they were like ready to defend themselves. They carried weapons. They were no nonsense. They had a good gut for it, you know?
Yeah.
Specifically, they had mentioned June Cicero, one of the most streetwise sex workers in Rochester. In addition to June Cicero was Darlene Trippi, who had partnered with Joanne Van Nostrand for safety. Of late, both had not been seen by anyone. In fact, just before she disappeared, June Cicero had bragged to the cops about how she wasn't afraid of the man. It was he who ought to be afraid of her. And they believed her. Fucking kidding me?
Well, thank goodness. She says she's fine. That means that we, the police, don't have to do anything now. Phew. Like,
I know you guys probably have gathered by now that I don't have the most beneficial view on police officers. I mean, even with my intense love of the behavioral analysis or behavioral science unit of the FBI, I still am not even totally sold on feds, especially after Waco. But
Waco,
sometimes you just want to take, yeah.
You know.
Well, MK Ultra was actually the CIA, which I mean, no one trusts the CIA.
That's still feds. I mean, that's all. Like, there's a Fed umbrella. Like, it's like IRS people are like, if you work for the IRS, you're a Fed.
So now there were these two, in addition to a black sex worker named Felicia Stevens and the long missing Maria Welsh. It was. I was going to try and say this line with a straight face, Brian, but it's not going to happen. It was time to get some copters up in the air to search for likely dump sites for them. Literally, they put copters with an apostrophe. I'm not shitting you. I shit you not, my friend.
Well, yeah, because you don't. Because helicopter, chopper, copter, as they've done it, whirlybird.
All right, we don't really have a lot of time here, so let's keep yeah.
Okay.
On December 31st, the morning of New Year's Eve, a trooper on road patrol in a rural area outside of Rochester spotted a pair of black jeans discarded and frozen along the roadside. He stopped to investigate and went through the pockets. He found an identification card with the name of Felicia Stevens. With this discovery, everyone assumed that she was dead. It was also clear, since the jeans had been found not far from Salmon Creek, that the killer was returning to former dumping grounds. Then Stevens's boots were found in separate areas. She could not get along in freezing temperatures without her boots. Yet a thorough search was nearly impossible at that time of year, even with search dogs. Everything was under snow or frozen over, and trying to whack out on the water proved to be super fucking dangerous. 4 missing women, no one had found a body, super frustrating. So this guy was now getting away with killing something like every week, and even after hundreds of hours of surveillance and detective work, they could not stop him. Nothing happened on New Year's Day, but then the next day, on January 2nd of 1990, the state police resumed the search for a body by air and ground. When winds came up from Lake Ontario, it made it impossible to see in the blowing snow, so they had to stop. The following morning, they were at it again. After hours spent covering the same ditches, canals, and creeks, the search was beginning to seem like it was pointless. They had looked everywhere. Wherever these women were, they were probably under snow, and no one was going to find them until after a thaw. Then, one team took off from Northampton Park for a final flight along Highway 31, where the clothing had been found, and back toward the city. Almost 2 years earlier, the first of 8 victims had been discovered there, so they decided to have just one last go. They flew low over Salmon Creek, scanning back and forth, alert for anything unusual, and then suddenly they saw something near a bridge. They flew closer and saw what appeared to be a human figure laying splayed out and face down on the surface of the ice. She was wearing a white top, like Felicia Stevens was reported to have worn when last seen, but nothing else. They hovered for a closer look, and made out a female with darkish skin, but not black. It could not be Felicia Stevens. But they had 3 other missing women, so this could be one of those. Then they noticed a Chevy Celebrity on the bridge, so they radioed to patrol units on the ground to check it out. A large, overweight man was there, and he appeared to be urinating. Then he got into his car and drove away. In the documentary, The Mind of a Serial Killer, the footage of the body from overhead is striking. From all appearances, it could only have been one of the missing women, and it was. It was June Cicero, the streetwise sex worker who was rumored to avoid all the cars she didn't know and had told the police that the killer should be afraid of her instead. She had accepted one final customer for the evening on the last evening that she had spoken with the cops, and it had turned out to be a fatal mistake. She had been asphyxiated by strangulation and then mutilated post-mortem. Her genital area had been sawed clean through, probably while she was frozen. Now investigators had to learn who the guy was on the bridge and find out what he had to say for himself. So finally, they've got a lead. Patrol units were hot on the trail of the man and the celebrity, and the helicopter team followed. They watched as the car pulled into a municipal parking lot across the street from the Wedgwood Nursing Home in Spencerport. The driver went into the nursing home, and a check on the license plate's number revealed that the car belonged to a woman named Clara Neal. The troopers took over while the helicopter team returned to protect the crime scene. They saw that there were fresh footprints in the snow, and that would be very good evidence. They roped everything off and called for more support. State Police Officer John Standing asked the man and the celebrity for an ID, and he produced it. His name was Arthur John Shawcross, 44 years old, though his hair was graying, he looked much older. And he said he thought that they'd followed him because he'd urinated out in the woods. That was his story anyway, and he agreed to cooperate. When asked for his driver's license, he admitted he did not have one, and then revealed that he had been in jail for manslaughter. That revelation struck everyone at once. This was no ordinary citizen who happened to get close to a crime scene. This was a one-time killer. The profilers had told them that this offender was returning to his victims, and that could very well be that they caught him what they caught him doing. By a sheer stroke of luck, they had flown over the scene at the exact time that he decided to have another look at his handiwork. In fact, he was there to have lunch over it. They weren't sure at that time yet that they had the right guy. They had to be careful. Interrogators often make mistakes by showing their eagerness and trying to rush someone into a confession, and they had spent too many hours in this case to blow it right then. So, investigator Dennis Blythe managed to persuade Shawcross to accompany him to the state police barracks for further questioning. Shawcross was happy to oblige and even signed forms that gave the troopers permission to search the car and his home. The police then took both him and Clara Neal in a different car to Brockport. An experienced interrogator, Charlie Militello, assisted Blythe with the questioning, and they soon got Shawcross to describe the places where he liked to fish. Most of them were where victims had been dumped. He also admitted that he'd been arrested 16 years earlier in Watertown because, quote, 2 kids died. He would not elaborate on these crimes. He insisted it was just a coincidence that he was parked over the body on Salmon Creek, that he was just driving around and had stopped to take a piss when the helicopter flew over. He hadn't seen anything. Though excited by what they heard and by the feeling they finally had the killer right in front of them, the investigators continued to build rapport rather than press for details. They wanted him to feel comfortable talking with them because they intended to question him again, and they wanted it to be voluntary. They had him in the interrogation room for about 5 hours, taking Clara home before they released him. He did finally tell them more details about how he'd killed the children, raping the little girl anally before he'd strangled her. Everyone was disgusted, but they tried not to show their feelings. Shawcross also told them how he'd had sexual relations with his younger sister, and he thought that that had something to do with why he'd assaulted a child, as well as why he'd killed so many people in Vietnam. He liked to talk about his accomplishments there. He'd been quite the soldier. While he was being questioned, a profile expert, characterized thus by Jack Olson but never named, advised them that a pedophile would not change his victim type to adult women. However, that profile expert was neither Ed Grant nor Greg McCrary, who knew that some killers just go for victims of opportunity who are vulnerable. Shawcross had been in prison for 15 years. He could have developed fantasies along different lines, or he might have learned that communities that get outraged over child murders might not care as much about sex workers. Not all serial killers choose the same victim type. That's an erroneous notion passed around in circles of academic psychology. Do you hear that, listeners?
You've had it coming for a long time, academic psychologists.
Listen, my background is in psychology. I've spent a lot of time in academic psychology. I have the utmost respect for the field, but sometimes I feel like they stick to things that have been disproven.
Yeah, I mean, and look, everybody nobody is above getting dunked on. And when it's your time to get dunked, it's time to get dunked, and that's okay. We still love you, academic psychology, but, maybe acknowledge the facts that you've chosen to research sometimes.
I want people to keep that in mind, because if you're thinking, oh, there's a serial killer near where I live, but I'm not in danger because I don't fit the victim profile, that might not save you. Be careful out there, guys. Make good choices. It was soon evident that Shawcross had self-serving explanations for everything he did, and officers fully expected that if he confessed to the recent spate of killings, he would have reasons for them as well that served his own purposes. Before they released him, they asked to take his photograph, and Shawcross allowed it. Investigators put it into a photo spread and brought it to several of the sex workers working Lyell Avenue. One was Joanne Von Nostrand, who had told the police about Mitch, the John who'd wanted her to pretend she was dead. She immediately identified him. That's the guy. Now, she knew for sure that he'd come close to being killed. That she'd come close to being killed. He'd reached for her throat several times during their encounter, but she had blocked him. She also indicated that Shawcross was the John with whom Elizabeth Gibson, another victim, had been last seen. Several other sex workers identified him as well. They all knew him as a regular customer who'd never been a problem. Now they know it's this guy. They've got to do their research and get their shit together so they can take him in, right?
Right.
So they get to work developing his background. Before talking with him, they want to know the facts. They also wanted to know how a sex offender who'd been imprisoned for manslaughter and pedophilia had been released into their area without anyone finding the records. This last part was on everyone's mind, since they had done a thorough search several times, and they were stunned when they discovered the truth. Shawcross had admitted to several crimes in Watertown, New York, an old factory town located on the Black River off Lake Ontario. It was the place where he'd grown up. As I said earlier, 2 months after coming to Rochester, Shawcross had a job packing salads for a catering company. When that didn't work, he got another job, and he used his free time to develop a relationship on the side with a woman named Clara Neal, often borrowing her car to go off on his own. When officers asked Clara to show them where they had often gone for lovers' rendezvous, each place was where bodies had been dumped.
Oh, no.
Yes.
I think I know what kind of car she might own.
Well, you already know, because it was the celebrity that they saw him in.
Aha!
Now the investigators had the background they needed to confirm their hunches, but officials from different agencies had argued over who should get jurisdiction for the interrogation and thus credit for solving this case. Like, really, guys? Really? Fuck you.
You can all be in the room, boys. You can share the serial killer.
Pick the best person for the job. Who the fuck cares who gets credit, as long as the best job is done?
As long as he isn't killing people at the end of the conversation, you know? Oh my gosh.
In a compromise that benefited everyone, Dennis Blythe of the New York State Police and Leonard Borriello, the key investigator for the Rochester PD, were selected to interview Shawcross together. He'd been under surveillance all night, and they were ready to pick him up again. But before they even faced him, there was a significant development. Just before 7 o'clock in the morning, at a spot not far from where June Cicero's body had been found, a deer hunter stumbled across the frozen body of Felicia Stevens, whose ID and clothing had been picked up along the road. She was lying face down, with her buttocks slightly elevated, the way many of the other victims had been found. The man phoned the police. Now Blythe and Borriello had the details of one more murder to think about. They approached Shawcross and asked if he would mind going with them again to clear some things up. In the amiable manner he'd adopted with them, he agreed to go, and they drove him to the places where certain events had happened. For example, they talked with him about Joanne von Nostrand, letting him know what they knew, and then stopped in several places where something significant had happened with a victim. Shawcross did not budge. Even when they said that they knew what he'd done, he refused to go along. When they told him that he'd been spotted with one of the victims on the last day she was seen alive, he shrugged it off as coincidence. They reminded him of his rights, but he said he didn't have any problem talking to them. As they pressed a little more with the evidence they had, Shawcross reacted in anger, but then settled down again. They feared the interview might reach an impasse, yet when Shawcross mentioned how concerned he was about Clara Neal, Blythe knew he now had a point of leverage. He suggested that since the car belonged to Clara, she might be involved, and they'd hate to think that that was true. Shawcross appeared to realize he was cornered. Blythe again asked, "Is Clara involved?" "No," he admitted, hanging his head. "Clara's not involved." They knew they had him. Within 28 minutes of starting the interview, he'd come close to admitting what he'd done. In another minute, he was talking about killing Elizabeth Gibson, and as they suspected, he offered reasons of provocation. She'd tried to steal his wallet, so he'd slapped her again and again. Later, he would say that the cops had provided this incentive, and so he had just used it. At one point, he said that she had just looked like his rejecting mother, so he continued to hit her. She'd kicked at him and broken the gear shift of his car, which angered him further, and he put his wrist against her throat and held it there until she went still. When he let go and checked, she was dead, so he'd driven around with her for a while looking for a place to dump her. When he found one, he removed her clothes and placed her face down in the woods. Then, as he drove home, he'd thrown her clothing out of the car window. When word came in that investigators had found an earring in Clara's car that had matched one that they had found on June Cicero, Shawcross became testy. He did not believe they actually had evidence. They brought in his wife and his girlfriend and then pressured him to spare these two the anguish of a long, drawn-out investigation. He considered this and then asked for a map and the photographs of the victims they had shown him before. He laid out 16 open cases, and he eliminated those that were not associated with him. He said that the murders he had done were, quote, business as usual. For each murder... I'm sorry?
So that business as usual took me aback. Like, that's horrifying.
Yeah. For each murder, he had a reason. Some, he said, ridiculed him, some had tried to steal from him, one just wouldn't shut up, several threatened to turn him in as the killer, and one, the homeless woman, had said that she'd tell his wife about their affair. This is all according to Shawcross, who is he just lies everything out of his mouth. As he's talking, he's lying.
Yeah.
So, the first victim, Dorothy Blackburn, supposedly had bitten into his penis during oral sex. He said, "There was blood everywhere. I thought I was gonna die."
Gee, what the...
I know. So in retaliation, he apparently grabbed her by the throat and bit her genital area in retaliation and then strangled her to death. He said, "I choked her for a good 10 minutes. Some of them he'd smothered with something over their faces, and with others he'd pressed his arm across their throats. As for the mutilation of June Stott, the woman he had known and had welcomed into his home for meals, it was to, quote, aid in decomposition because he had, quote, cared about her. His explanations were hollow, but at least he was offering details and solving a few mysteries. As he talked, it became clear what the strange marks were that had been found across Dorothy Blackburn's chest. Apparently, Shawcross liked to squire his victims around in the front seat of his car before dumping them, so he'd used a bungee cord to tie them in place. Yeah.
I always find the dispassion with which, these people describe their killings as, it's haunting to me.
Yeah.
Because, I think even someone who would consider them of themselves a mildly violent person, someone who gets into like street brawls and things, this is still horrifying. This is like, it's because it's all bullshit.
Yeah.
Like his reasons are like even if you were to take him at his word for the one story where the woman bit his junk, and in retaliation he bit hers off, it's like that's
not off, just bit it.
Okay, fair. But it was the separate woman that had been cut off.
Yeah, but that was post-mortem.
Okay, right. But it to have the type of mind that says this is a reasonable excuse to give is just chilling.
The detectives showed him photographs of the two missing women, Maria Welsh and Darlene Trippi. He admitted that he'd killed them both and marked on a map where he'd left them. Eventually, he led investigators late that evening into the cold to the exact places where he had dumped their bodies. One had been left sitting up in some bushes near the river, and the other dumped in water near some houses. The pool had iced over, and she was like under the ice. The article describes her as looking like some ethereal underwater fairy out of Arthurian mythology. Both women had been asphyxiated. As investigators drove Shawcross back from these places, they took him by the area where they'd found Felicia Stevens and noticed that he seemed to recognize it, though he initially denied it by saying, quote, "I don't do black women." Yet they used what they'd observed of his behavior as leverage to get him to finally confess to her murder. According to him, she had run up to his car to solicit his business, and her head had gotten caught in his automatic car window, nearly killing her. So he'd pulled her into the car to finish strangling her. He was adamant that there had been nothing intimate. He did not like black prostitutes. He later told someone else that he killed a black prostitute specifically to throw the police off his trail.
I couldn't have killed that woman. I'm too racist to hire a black sex worker.
Right?
Like, that's what he thinks is gonna work.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Some investigators, including Greg McCreary, believe that Shawcross was good for one more murder than those to which he admitted, the black sex worker named Kimberly Logan that I had mentioned earlier, who was dumped in someone's yard and had been covered with leaves, and leaves had also been stuffed down her throat.
Like
which
Karen
was the same,
Hill.
Yes, the same MO as 8-year-old victim in Watertown, Karen Ann Hill. Yet Shawcross would not accept this one as his, and he was never prosecuted for it. When he finally gave his complete formal confession to a court stenographer, it was 79 pages long. On the advice of his attorney, David Moranti, who was appointed by the court, he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. I think we should leave the trial for part 2.
Part 2?
Yes.
Zoe, you didn't tell me at the beginning of this that we were going into a part 2. You're going to make me wait. You're going to make me and our listeners wait one whole week to hear about what happened at this guy's trial?
Yeah, because it's some good shit.
Well, fuck. Listeners, I hope you're as excited as I am to hear about this, quote, good shit, unquote, that Zoe has to share with us about the trial of Arthur Shawcross.
To clarify, when I say good shit, I don't mean any of it is good. It's all terrible, but
Right.
It's like the most ridiculous series of events, and it's super interesting, and it's all worth examination.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
But
Good shit, not literal good shit right there. Good shit, good shit.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Knife to Meet You. If you're not already listening to us on Apple Podcasts, that is something you can do now. We are holding a special giveaway through the month of July. If you leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, you get entered for a $25 Amazon gift card. So go ahead and hop on Apple Podcasts. The link is down in the description, and leave us a review. Really appreciate it. Until next week, everybody, it's been Knife to Meet You. Have a good one.